You're kidding me, right? This is a rifle competition, not a nursing home shuffleboard tournament. Someone needs to tell this guy before he hurts himself." The words came from a 29-year-old named Chet Molloy, spoken loud enough to carry across 3 shooting benches and land exactly where he intended them to land. On the shoulders of the 73-year-old man standing quietly at the end of the registration line at the Dominion Precision Invitational, held each August on a stretch of flat prairie land outside of Portage la Prairie, Manitoba, where the horizon runs so far in every direction that the sky feels like something pressing down on you personally. The old man didn't turn around. He didn't stiffen. He didn't do anything at all except shift the rifle case he was carrying from his right hand to his left, slowly, the way a man does when his joints have been giving him trouble since 1987, and he's learned not to fight it. His name was Frederick Dunmore, and if you'd passed him on the street in Brandon, Manitoba, on any given Tuesday morning, you'd have seen a tall man, slightly stooped at the shoulder, moving carefully along the sidewalk in a pair of brown work boots that had been risoled twice. He wore a quilted canvas jacket the colour of old mustard, slightly too large across the chest now, and a wool cap pulled low over ears that had been asking for hearing aids for the better part of a decade. He drove a 2001 Dodge pickup the colour of dried clay with a cracked side mirror held in place by 2 wraps of electrical tape. He lived alone in a house on the edge of town where the road turned to gravel, in a neighbourhood that had been working class once and was now simply old. He kept a vegetable garden that his neighbours occasionally stole from, which he allowed because he grew more than he could eat, and because confrontation had never interested him much. He spent his mornings doing small engine repair out of his garage, lawnmowers, snowblowers, generators, for whatever people thought was fair to leave on the workbench in an envelope. Some weeks, the envelopes were generous, some weeks they weren't. He didn't keep a price list. He ate the same breakfast every morning. 2 eggs scrambled, brown toast, black tea from a chipped ceramic mug that had belonged to his wife Norma, who had passed 3 winters ago from a stroke that came without warning on a Thursday afternoon while she was hanging laundry in the side yard. The mug had a small chip on the rim and a faded illustration of a loon on the side that had mostly washed away over 20 years. He drank from that chip deliberately. He thought it was important not to avoid the things that reminded him of her. He had come to the Dominion Precision Invitational, not because he needed the prize money, though $1,400 in outstanding furnace repair bills and a property tax notice sitting on his kitchen counter suggested he could use it. He had come because his son-in-law, a well-meaning man named Phil, who worried too loudly and too often, had signed him up without asking 8 months ago as a way of getting him out of the garage and into the world. "You used to shoot," Phil had said, as if that explained anything. Frederick Dunmore had looked at him for a long moment over the kitchen table, and said, "I did," in a tone that closed the conversation without locking the door. The challenge at the Dominion Precision Invitational was this: a 12-inch steel plate, painted a flat white, set at 900 yards across a flat Manitoba field in the full August heat. Iron sights only, 1 round. The prize was $5,000 in cash, and it had sat uncollected for 4 consecutive years, running because the shot was, by any reasonable competitive standard, unreasonable. 900 yards with iron sights required a kind of discipline that most modern shooters had simply never been trained to cultivate. Stillness not just in the body but in the mind, a learned indifference to the wind, to the light, to the crowd, to the wanting of the thing itself. 47 shooters had already tried that weekend. 47 had failed. If you believe that age is not a deficit and that experience is the only currency that truly holds its value, type the word earned in the comments right now before this is over, because what Frederick Dunmore was about to do on that flat Manitoba field was the kind of thing that stays with the people who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Not because it was dramatic, because it was quiet. He reached the front of the registration line. The young man behind the folding table, maybe 22, a volunteer in a bright orange vest, looked up and then looked behind Frederick, as if checking whether he'd come with someone. "Sir, this is the Iron Sights Division. Just to be clear." "I understand that," Frederick said. "Thank you. And the firearm you're bringing, is it your own?" Frederick set the case on the table and unclipped the latches. Inside, nested in foam cut to its exact shape, was a rifle that the young volunteer in the orange vest had very clearly never seen outside of a museum. A Parker-Hale Model 82 bolt-action .308 Winchester, with iron sights that had been fitted and zeroed by hand. It was not a common rifle. It had not been manufactured since 1985. The bluing on the barrel had gone slightly grey at the muzzle from long storage, but the action was clean and the sights were precise, and the stock had been rubbed with linseed oil until it glowed faintly like a piece of furniture somebody loved. "That's," the young volunteer started. "Mine," Frederick said. "Long time." Behind him in the line, Chet Molloy had drifted close enough to see into the case. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like an exhale pushed through a smirk. "That thing's older than my dad," he said to the man beside him, another competitor in a fitted technical shooting shirt with a sponsor's name on the chest. "Is there an antique category? Maybe he got turned around." His companion laughed. Not meanly, exactly. The way people laugh when they're following someone else's lead and haven't yet decided whether to feel bad about it. The young volunteer looked between them and then back at Frederick, uncomfortable in the particular way that young people get when they can feel something unkind happening in front of them and aren't sure what their role is. Frederick closed the case latches one at a time. He lifted the case from the table with both hands, picked up his numbered card, 48, and walked toward the firing line without hurrying. He moved through the crowd of competitors and spectators the way water finds a path. Not pushing, not asserting, simply present and in motion. People stepped aside without entirely knowing why. The firing line was set along a low ridge of packed earth, with the competitors' benches facing west across the field. In August, on the Manitoba prairie, the afternoon light comes in at a low angle that turns everything gold and slightly merciless. The heat rose off the ground in long, slow waves. The wind was variable, 2 or 3 kilometers out of the northwest, shifting unpredictably every 4 or 5 minutes, which was worse than a steady wind because it required a shooter to wait rather than calculate, and waiting is the thing that most people, in their bones, are worst at. Word had moved through the crowd the way word does at small events, quietly and completely. People who'd been browsing the vendor tables came back to the line. A handful of children who had been sitting in the bed of a pickup truck eating chips turned around to watch. An older woman in a folding chair near the judge's tent looked up from her book and didn't look back down. The range safety officer at the Dominion Precision Invitational that year was a woman named Corporal Okonkwo, retired, who had spent 18 years with the Canadian Army and still moved and spoke with the kind of authority that doesn't require volume. She met Frederick at the bench and shook his hand. "Number 48, you've got 3 minutes from the time you settle, sir, 1 round. Wind's been sitting at 2 to 3 from the northwest, but it's been shifting on us all afternoon. Plate is painted white, 12 inches across, 900 yards. Spotters are on radio." She paused. "Do you want a rundown on the sights adjustment recommendations? We've had 47 shooters go before you. I can share what the successful—" "Thank you," Frederick said. "I'll take the wind." Corporal Okonkwo looked at him. Something moved across her expression, very briefly. That wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite surprise. It was the look of someone who has trained long enough to know the difference between confidence and bravado, and has not seen actual confidence in some time. "Understood," she said. "Bench is yours." Frederick set the case down beside the bench and opened it. He lifted the Parker-Hale out with both hands and set it on the rest. He sat down on the bench. He did not adjust anything immediately. He did not load the round. He placed both hands flat on his thighs and looked out across the field at the white plate, which from 900 yards was barely a suggestion. A small, pale interruption in the yellow distance. He sat like that for 45 seconds without moving. Chet Molloy, who had positioned himself near the rope line 20 feet behind the bench, turned to his companion and said, "Just loud enough. Is he meditating? Did someone bring their grandpa to a rifle meet?" A few people nearby smiled. A few looked at their feet. But Corporal Okonkwo was watching Frederick Dunmore, with her full attention now, and she was not smiling. She had seen this before, once a long time ago, in a different context entirely, and the memory had surfaced suddenly and completely the way old memories do when the present moment reaches back and touches them. She had seen a man sit at a rest with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes open and still, and she had been told afterward by people who knew things she didn't yet know that what she'd witnessed was not stillness at all. It was the opposite of stillness. It was everything in the body redirecting inward. It was a man becoming very, very small on purpose. She didn't say anything. She watched. After perhaps a minute and a half, Frederick Dunmore reached forward and loaded the single round into the chamber with a motion that was so smooth and so economical it seemed to belong to a man 20 years younger. He brought the rifle stock to his shoulder. He made one small adjustment to his position, a shift of perhaps half an inch in his cheekbone against the stock. He looked through the iron sights at a plate that was 900 yards away and 2.5 inches wide in his field of vision. He breathed in once through his nose. He breathed out, long and measured, until his lungs were almost empty, and then he waited. He waited at the bottom of that breath in the stillness below breathing for the wind. The crowd had gone almost entirely quiet. Even Chet Molloy had stopped talking. 3 seconds passed. 4. 5. The shot, when it came, was a single clean sound that moved across the prairie and kept going, the way sound does on flat land, fading and never quite arriving at silence. For 1 full second, nothing. And then from 900 yards across the Manitoba field, the unmistakable high, clear ring of a 12-inch steel plate struck true, rang back to them through the afternoon air. The radio crackled immediately. Confirmed hit, center plate, 48 is on. Corporal Okonkwo felt the breath leave her body. She was not a woman who surprised easily. She had been surprised exactly twice in her professional life. This was the 3rd time. The crowd broke open. Someone at the back whooped. Applause came in a wave that started near the judge's tent and rolled outward. The older woman near the tent had closed her book and was standing. The children in the pickup bed were up on their feet. Chet Molloy stood with his arms at his sides and his mouth open slightly, saying nothing. Frederick Dunmore lowered the rifle from his shoulder, set it carefully on the bench rest, and sat there for a moment looking out at the field. His hands, Corporal Okonkwo noticed, were not trembling. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and took out a folded photograph, looked at it briefly, and put it back. No one saw what was in the photograph. No one ever asked. He stood up slowly, the way tall men who've been sitting do, unfolding joint by joint. He picked up his rifle case and turned toward the judge's tent to collect his paperwork. Corporal Okonkwo stepped in front of him. She didn't block his path. She simply placed herself in it, and something in her expression stopped him with more certainty than a hand on the arm would have. "Sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, below the noise of the crowd. "I need to ask you something, and I'm going to ask you to be honest with me." Frederick looked at her and waited. "What unit?" she said. "And when?" A pause. "3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry," Frederick Dunmore said. "Medak Pocket, 1993. Corporal Okonkwo's face changed in a way that the people nearby who were watching her face later tried to describe and couldn't quite. It was not grief exactly. It was not pride exactly. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a piece of a story for 30 years and has just discovered that another piece exists. "I know what happened there," she said. "I was told. When I was in training, a warrant officer told our whole platoon the story of what a PPCLI sniper did in the Medak during the ceasefire to keep the Croatian forces from advancing on the UN position. He never said the man's name." She stopped. "He said the man had asked specifically not to be named." Frederick Dunmore said nothing. He looked at her steadily. "He said the shooter was at 1,000 meters with iron sights, because his optics had been compromised by a grenade fragment the previous day. He said the man held a position alone for 2 hours and 20 minutes and kept an entire flank quiet long enough for the UN battalion to establish its line." She paused again. "He said it was the most disciplined piece of field work he had ever seen in his entire career. He said shooter refused the citation. Said he'd done what the situation required, and it wasn't more than that." The crowd nearby had gone quiet, trying to hear. Frederick Dunmore did not look at the crowd. "That warrant officer," he said finally, older man, spoke very slowly. "Yes, Macpherson." Corporal Okonkwo closed her eyes for a moment. "He passed in 2019. He talked about it until the end." The silence between them lasted the length of a breath. At that moment, a dark green government issue SUV pulled into the gravel lot at the edge of the competition grounds, moving with that particular unhurried deliberateness that draws every eye without trying. It parked beside the timing tent. The door opened, and a man stepped out who was somewhere in his middle 60s, with the posture of someone who has stood straight so long it has become structural. He wore a civilian jacket and no insignia, but he walked across the gravel the way a person walks who has spent their life being the one other people arrange themselves around. He was Brigadier-General Martin Castle, retired, currently serving as the civilian advisor to the Department of National Defense's Veterans Heritage Program. A man whose name appeared on plaques in 3 different provinces, and who appeared in public exactly as often as he judged necessary, which was not very often. He had seen the shot from the far end of the viewing area. He had seen it through a pair of binoculars he had not put down since Frederick Dunmore sat down at the bench. He walked directly across the field to where Frederick was standing. The crowd parted without being asked to, which was a thing that happened around Martin Castle without his ever seeming to cause it. The event coordinator, a compact, energetic man named Dale, who had organized the Dominion Precision Invitational for 6 years as a way to promote his ammunition distribution company, and had long since decided the $5,000 prize was never going to be claimed, moved to intercept him. "General Castle, sir, we weren't expecting. If I'd known you were going to be here in person, we would have arranged." Castle raised one hand, still walking. He stopped when he reached Frederick Dunmore, and they stood looking at each other for a moment. Then Brigadier-General Martin Castle, in front of 200 and some spectators on a Manitoba prairie, raised his right hand to his brow in a salute that was precise and deliberate, and carried in it everything that 30 years of service had taught him about what the gesture meant. "Warrant Officer Dunmore," he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. The crowd went entirely still. Frederick Dunmore returned the salute. Slowly, exactly, the way it had been done when he learned it. Castle turned to face the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice carried the way voices do on flat open land. "In September of 1993, he said, a small UN contingent, including a PPCLI battalion, was attempting to enforce a ceasefire in the Medak Pocket, in what is now Croatia. The Croatian army was in violation of that ceasefire and advancing on a position that, if it fell, would have resulted in a massacre of civilians in the valley below." He stopped. "Let that land." A warrant officer from the 3rd Battalion held a forward observation position alone for 2 hours and 22 minutes, with iron sights, because his scope had been destroyed the previous day by fragmentation, and he suppressed an entire flank with 4 rounds. 4 rounds, at distances that our chain of command later reviewed and did not publicly disclose because they were concerned no one would find them credible. Someone in the crowd said something softly that was not a word. "He refused the citation," Castle continued. "He said, and I'm going to quote this because I have had it memorized for 31 years, he said, the situation required it, and I was there, and those are the only 2 qualifications that matter." He paused. He went home. He fixed engines in a garage in Brandon. He grew tomatoes. He drank his tea. He did not tell anyone what he had done. He would not have told you today. He would have taken his prize money and driven home in that truck and watched the news and gone to bed. He looked at Frederick. The Canadian military owes this man more than it has said out loud. I am saying it out loud today. The applause that came then was not like the applause after the shot. That had been surprise and excitement, the release of held breath. This was different. This was slower and quieter, and came from somewhere deeper in the chest. The kind of applause that people give when they understand that they are in the presence of something that already happened a long time ago and is only now arriving in the room. Chet Molloy was standing near the back of the crowd with his hands at his sides. He was looking at the ground. His face was the color and texture of a man who is working very hard not to disappear. The prize coordinator brought the check in a plain envelope, $5,000. Frederick took it, folded it once, and put it in the inside breast pocket of his canvas jacket next to the photograph. He shook the event coordinator's hand. He shook Corporal Okonkwo's hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake. And she nodded at him, and that was that. Brigadier-General Castle walked beside him across the gravel to the parking lot, and the 2 men stood together beside Frederick's old Dodge pickup for a long time while the sun dropped toward the western edge of the Manitoba sky and turned everything briefly orange and then deep red. No one approached them. People drifted back toward the vendor tables and the timing tent, but gave the parking lot a wide berth, instinctively, the way people do when they sense that a private conversation is happening and that it belongs to the people having it. When Frederick finally opened the truck door and got in, the crowd that had gathered along the edge of the parking lot, nobody had organized this, nobody had suggested it, stood quiet on both sides of the gravel lane as he backed out and shifted into drive. He raised one hand from the steering wheel briefly as he passed, the way people do in small towns when they pass each other on the highway, and then the clay-coloured truck moved down the lane and turned onto the road and became small against the prairie sky and then was gone. Chet Molloy had already left. No one noticed exactly when. Corporal Okonkwo stood at the edge of the firing line for a long time after, looking west down the range at the white plate 900 yards away, which was now glowing faintly in the last light, and she thought about a warrant officer whose name her instructor had refused to give, and a story that had been kept deliberately small by the man it belonged to, and the particular discipline it takes to do something extraordinary and then go home and say nothing. Dale, the event coordinator, sat in a folding chair outside the timing tent long after his volunteers had packed up the tables and driven away. He had built this event as a marketing exercise. He had set the prize at $5,000 because his accountant had told him it would never be paid out. He sat and looked at the steel plate out across the field, and he thought about what it would mean to have done something real in your life, and chosen not to tell anyone, and whether he had ever in his 44 years done anything that required that kind of choosing. He didn't reach a comfortable answer. The following spring, the Dominion Precision Invitational added a new division called the Iron Standard. No optics, no exceptions, open to competitors of any age. The application page noted, without elaboration, that the division had been created to honor the discipline of a style of shooting that predated modern equipment and would outlast it. The prize for that division was set at $15,000. Frederick Dunmore did not return to compete. He had, as far as anyone could tell, decided that once was enough. He paid the furnace bill and the property tax notice, and put the remainder in an account he'd opened for his granddaughter's university fund, a fact that came out quietly 3 months later, when his daughter mentioned it to Phil, who mentioned it to someone at work, who mentioned it without expecting it to go anywhere. It went everywhere the way those things do. He still fixes small engines in the garage on the edge of Brandon. He still drinks black tea from a chipped mug with a faded loon on the side. On clear mornings, when the light comes in low through the garage window and catches the dust in the air, he sometimes stops what he's doing for a moment and looks out at the vegetable garden, and whatever he's thinking in those moments is his alone, and has always been his alone, and will remain so. That is the kind of man he is. Not the kind who asks to be remembered, the kind who simply was there when it mattered and did what the moment asked of him, and then went back to the work.